The call for help. Captain Mark Avery stared out the window of the bridge, his hands tightly gripping the control panel. The ship, once a powerful vessel, now floated in space like a wounded animal. Its engines were damaged, its shields failing, and the crew was exhausted, on the verge of collapse. Their last fight with the Deathworlders had cost them everything. Only a few of the crew members remained alive, scattered across the ship, trying to tend to their wounds. Mark's mind raced. They had only one hope left, sending an SOS to Earth. But doing so would be risky. The Deathworlders were relentless, and they would surely track the signal. The captain knew the message would come too late for many, but it was the only choice they had. It was better to die fighting for survival than to be slaughtered without a chance. His eyes scanned the empty control room. There were only a few crew members left. Lieutenant Sarah, the communications officer, sat at her station, her face pale, her eyes tired but focused. She knew what was at stake. "We can't hold out much longer, Captain," Sarah said, her voice weak. "The Deathworlders are closing in fast. I don't think we have the time to wait for reinforcements." Mark nodded grimly. He had known that the moment the Deathworlders ambushed them. They had underestimated the enemy, thinking their ship's advanced technology would protect them. They were wrong. "I know, Lieutenant," he said. "But we have no choice. We send the signal now, or we die." The room fell silent. No one spoke, but everyone understood. The crew had fought hard, but they were outmatched. And now they were depending on Earth, their home planet, for help. Mark turned to Sarah. "Prepare the SOS," he ordered. "I want that signal sent to Earth now." She hesitated, looking at the captain with concern. "Sir, if we send the signal, we'll be exposing ourselves completely. The Deathworlders will know exactly where we are." "I'm aware of that," Mark replied, his voice firm. "But it's our only shot. We don't have any time left. Do it, Sarah." Sarah took a deep breath and turned back to her console. Her hands moved over the buttons, inputting the necessary coordinates to send the message. Every second felt like an eternity. Mark could hear the hum of the ship's remaining systems, but it was all he could hear. The rest of the ship felt eerily quiet, as if the entire crew was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. "Message sent," Sarah finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's out there." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe that help was on the way, that Earth's fleet would come to their rescue in time. But deep down, he knew that Earth was too far away. It would take days for them to arrive, and the Deathworlders were already close. The sound of the Deathworlder ship's engines could be heard faintly through the walls. Mark knew they were getting closer. He quickly moved to the communication console, trying to get a signal from Earth. But there was nothing. The Deathworlders had jammed their communications. "Captain," Sarah said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "They're coming. We don't have much time." Mark's eyes narrowed. The Deathworlders had the technology to hunt down their enemies. They were ruthless, and they showed no mercy. Mark had seen what they did to those they captured. His mind flashed with images of his fallen crew members, and he swore silently that he wouldn't let them die in vain. "We'll fight," Mark said firmly, turning to face his crew. "We'll hold them off for as long as we can." He knew it wouldn't be enough. The Deathworlders were too powerful, and their ship was too damaged, but they wouldn't go down without a fight. They would make sure that Earth knew what had happened. They would make sure that humanity would remember them. The ship rocked as the Deathworlders fired their first blast, shaking the entire vessel. The lights flickered and alarms blared, warning the crew of the incoming attack. "Brace for impact." Mark shouted, his voice calm despite the chaos. "All hands, get to your stations." The crew scrambled into action, running to their assigned posts. Mark stood in the center of the bridge, watching as the ship was rocked by another blast. He could feel the cold weight of fear creeping into his chest, but he pushed it away. Now was not the time for fear. It was time for action. "We're going to fight back," Mark muttered under his breath. We're going to make them regret ever stepping foot on this ship. The Deathworlders were coming for them, but Mark Avery and his crew weren't going down without a fight. They had sent the SOS to Earth, and now they would do everything they could to hold out until help arrived. It was a long shot, but it was all they had, and as the ship's systems began to fail, Mark couldn't help but wonder, would Earth even receive the signal? Would they make it in time? Or would his crew's final stand become just another forgotten story in the vast emptiness of space? Let me know if you need any adjustments. The cost of calling for help the Deathworlder ship was closing in fast. The hum of their engines echoed through the corridors of Captain Mark Avery's ship like the growl of a predator hunting its prey. Mark stood on the bridge, his eyes locked on the display, watching as the large enemy vessel drew closer. They had made their choice. The SOS had been sent, but the cost was already clear. The Deathworlders would come, and they would show no mercy. The crew was scattered around the ship, trying to hold on to any semblance of control. The ship was dying, and so was their hope. Mark knew they couldn't outrun the Deathworlders. Their technology was far superior. There was only one thing left to do: fight. "Captain," Lieutenant Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, filled with urgency. "The Deathworlders are almost here. We won't last long if we don't find a way to fight back." Mark didn't respond right away. His mind raced. He had no real plan. The crew was too few, the ship too damaged. They had no chance against the incoming assault. The Deathworlders were known for their brutal efficiency. They destroyed everything in their path, leaving no survivors. That's what they did. That's what they were. He knew that sending the SOS had sealed their fate, but it was the only option left. "Get to your stations," Mark ordered, his voice steady but his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "We'll fight them off as best we can." Sarah nodded and moved quickly, communicating orders to the other crew members, trying to prepare them for the battle ahead. The crew, despite their fear and exhaustion, moved into action. There was no other choice now but to fight. The Deathworlders would stop at nothing to wipe them out, but they weren't going to make it easy. Mark's eyes flickered to the communication console, hoping against hope that Earth's fleet had received the distress signal and was on its way. But the screen remained dark, the silence of space mocking their desperation. He couldn't let his hope slip away, not yet. Earth's fleet had to be coming. He didn't know how much time they had left, but he knew they couldn't wait forever. As the Deathworlder ship grew larger on the radar, a sudden blast shook the ship, sending everyone stumbling. The lights flickered and alarms blared, signaling that they had been hit. The ship groaned, the hull shuddering under the force of the strike. Mark gritted his teeth, determined not to let the crew see how much the blow affected him. "We're going to fight," Mark said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We'll make them regret ever coming here." The crew, though terrified, nodded and prepared to defend the ship. Mark watched as Sarah and the others scrambled to their stations. He knew they were all scared, but they had no choice but to fight. He wasn't about to let his crew die without putting up a fight. The ship rocked again, this time harder than before. The Deathworlders were firing relentlessly, tearing into the ship's defenses. Mark could feel the cold sweat on his brow, but he pushed it aside. This was it. There was no turning back now. Brace for impact. Mark shouted, his voice sharp. "Get to the escape pods if we can't hold them off." The crew scattered, taking their positions as best they could. The ship was in shambles, but they still had weapons. They still had their determination. Mark wasn't sure how long they could hold out, but as long as they were breathing, they would keep fighting. Another blast hit, and the ship lurched violently, sending crew members crashing to the floor. Mark gripped the control panel tightly, his knuckles white. He looked at Sarah, who was still at her station, working tirelessly despite the chaos around her. She was one of the few left who hadn't given in to the fear. "We need to focus on the engines," Mark ordered. "If we can get them back online, we might be able to outmaneuver them. We need that power. Sarah's eyes met his, her face pale but determined. "I'll try, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. Mark nodded, turning back to the view screen as the Deathworlders ship loomed closer. They had sent the SOS, but now they had to deal with the consequences. The enemy was already on their doorstep, and there was no room for mistakes. He knew the Deathworlders would come to claim their prize, but they would not do so without a fight. A loud crash interrupted his thoughts, and the ship shuddered once more. The Deathworlders were boarding. Mark's heart pounded as he realized the true cost of their call for help. They had reached out to Earth, but Earth was still too far away. And now they would face the wrath of the Deathworlders alone. "We fight to the end," Mark said, his voice cold and resolute. "For humanity, for our crew, the Deathworlders were coming." But as long as there was breath in his body, Mark Avery was going to make sure they knew one thing: humanity would never be an easy target. The bloodbath begins. The sounds of chaos filled the air as the Deathworlders breached the ship. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, and the sound of their alien weapons charging made the crew's blood run cold. Mark Avery stood on the bridge, watching as his crew scrambled to prepare for the inevitable. The enemy had arrived, and the fight was about to begin. He gripped the control panel, trying to steady his nerves, but the weight of what was about to happen was suffocating. There was no turning back now. The ship groaned under the assault, its hull straining against the power of the Deathworlders' weapons. Mark knew the ship was already too damaged to withstand much more. The first of the Deathworlders appeared in the hallway outside the bridge. It was a hulking creature, towering over the humans with thick, armored skin that seemed impervious to their weapons. It carried a massive weapon, and its eyes burned with a cruel, predatory gleam. Mark's heart raced as the alien stepped into view, its massive frame blocking the hallway. His crew was ready, but no one was ready for the brutality of what came next. The first shot from the Deathworlders' weapon struck the wall near Mark's head, showering the bridge with sparks. The blast sent his crew scattering for cover, and for a moment, there was only chaos. Sarah, her face pale and tight with fear, crawled behind the control panel, frantically trying to regain control of the ship's systems. The Deathworlders' weapon fired again, this time hitting one of the bridge's power conduits, and the lights flickered. The ship was losing power rapidly, and Mark could feel the cold rush of panic creeping up his spine. He forced it back, focusing on what had to be done. "Hold the line," Mark shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the incoming attack. He could hear the sound of heavy boots approaching, signaling that more Deathworlders were coming. He could only hope that the small crew still alive on the ship would be able to hold their ground. The Deathworlders' weapons were terrifyingly powerful, and every shot seemed to tear apart the ship's walls. Mark knew they would not survive long if they didn't act quickly. He looked over at Lieutenant Sarah, who was still trying to bring the ship's weapons online. "Sarah, do you have anything?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising terror inside him. "I'm trying, Captain," she said, her voice strained. "But they've disabled most of the systems. We're barely holding it together." Another blast hit the ship, this one shaking the bridge so violently that it threw Mark off balance. He hit the floor with a hard thud, his head spinning. He quickly pushed himself up, eyes darting to the view screen. He could see the Deathworlder ship just outside, its massive guns aimed at their hull. The attack was relentless, each blast tearing through their defenses. Mark knew they didn't have much time before the ship was completely destroyed. He reached for the comms, speaking into the microphone with urgency. "This is Captain Mark Avery of the USS Orion. We are under attack by Deathworlders. We need reinforcements now." There was no answer. The signal was cut off. They were on their own. The Deathworlders' roar filled the hallways as it moved forward, its footsteps shaking the walls. It was clear that the invaders wanted nothing more than to destroy everything in their path. Mark's crew was too small, too weak to stand up to their overwhelming force, but that didn't mean they were going to go down easily. The crew members who were still alive began to rally, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, whether they were human-made or scavenged, from the ship's storage. They knew they had only one chance to fight back, and they would take it. The first firefight was brutal. The Deathworlders' weapons were much stronger than anything the humans had, and their speed and strength were terrifying. But the humans fought with everything they had, refusing to give up even as the odds stacked higher against them. Mark could see the faces of his crew, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They were terrified, yes, but they knew this was their only chance to survive. As the battle raged on, the corridors of the ship became a maze of blood, fire, and wreckage. Mark could hear the screams of his crew as they fought, each one of them struggling to stay alive for as long as possible. He could hear the unmistakable sound of the Deathworlders' weapons tearing through flesh and bone, and his heart twisted. In pain, his crew was dying, and there was nothing he could do to save them. The enemy was everywhere now. Mark heard the crash of heavy footsteps as another Deathworlder stormed onto the bridge. It was followed by two more, each one more terrifying than the last. Mark grabbed his weapon, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the incoming invaders. He didn't want to die, but he knew they had no chance against these creatures. Fight! Mark shouted as the Deathworlders advanced, his voice breaking the silence. For humanity, for your crew. He fired, the sound of his gun a sharp echo in the chaos. The blast missed the first Deathworlder, but it struck the wall beside it, sending sparks flying. Mark knew it wouldn't be enough. It wasn't enough for any of them. The Deathworlders were coming for them all, and the crew of the USS Orion had no choice but to give everything they had. The human spirit. The sounds of the battle echoed through the ship, but inside the bridge, a quiet determination took hold. Captain Mark Avery stood at the center of it all, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve unbroken. His crew was dying around him, and the Deathworlders were closing in on every side, but something deep inside Mark refused to surrender. They had fought long and hard to get this far, and no matter the odds, he would not let them fall without a fight. As another wave of Deathworlders stormed through the corridors, Mark heard the crackling of Cum's static filling the air. He was sure no one could hear him anymore. Earth was too far away. The reinforcements they had prayed for were not coming in time. The crew had already given everything they could, and now it was up to Mark to hold the line for as long as he could. But one thing was clear: the humans aboard this ship were no ordinary crew. Even in the face of certain death, they refused to quit. He looked over at Lieutenant Sarah, who was still at her post, working desperately to restore whatever systems they could. Sweat poured down her face, but her hands moved with precise efficiency. Mark could see the strain in her eyes, but there was no hesitation. She was still fighting. She was still trying. And that was what gave him hope. "Sarah," Mark said, his voice low but filled with purpose, "how much longer until we can get the engines back online?" Sarah didn't turn away from her station, but spoke without breaking her focus. "A few minutes at most, Captain. But they're not going to give us that long." Mark knew she was right. The Deathworlders were relentless, and they wouldn't give them any time to recover. But Sarah's words were a reminder of the strength the crew still had left. Even in the face of certain defeat, it was a reminder that, no matter how hopeless it seemed, they would continue to fight. Another blast rocked the ship, and this time the lights flickered and went out. The entire bridge was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, Mark could only hear the pounding of his own heart in the silence. Then, the emergency lights kicked on, casting a dim red glow across the room. "We can't keep up like this," Sarah whispered. "The ship's systems are failing." "We don't need the ship's systems," Mark replied, his voice steady as he turned to face her. "We need to hold on, Sarah. We need to keep fighting. Earth is still out there, and they will come for US. We can't give up. Not yet." Sarah nodded, her face set in the mask of determination. She wasn't going to stop. No one on this ship was going to stop. They had come too far, and they had fought too hard to let this be the end. The sound of Deathworlder footsteps echoed closer, and Mark could feel his pulse quicken. There was no more time. They had to make a stand now, or they would be wiped out. He grabbed his rifle and turned toward the door. He could hear the crew moving behind him, ready to face whatever came next. "Let's give them hell," Mark muttered under his breath. The crew, battered and bloodied, followed him into the darkness. They moved through the corridors in silence, each person knowing the risks they were taking. They didn't have the strength to win this fight, but they had something more important: the will to survive. The Deathworlders had invaded their ship, and now they were coming for them. But Mark had no intention of going down without a fight. The humans aboard this ship were more than just survivors. They were fighters. The Deathworlders could take their ship, they could take their bodies, but they would never take their spirit. Mark and his crew reached the main hall, and the first Deathworlder they saw was no more than a silhouette in the dim light. It raised its weapon, but before it could fire, Mark's rifle roared to life. The shot hit the Deathworlder square in the chest, sending it sprawling back with a screech. Mark didn't wait to see if it was dead. He was already moving forward, and the rest of the crew followed suit. They didn't have the numbers, but what they lacked in strength, they made up for with their determination. Each of them fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, pushing back against the superior enemy forces. For every human that fell, another stepped forward to take their place, ready to face the invaders with nothing but their resolve. Mark's heart pounded as he led his crew through the chaos. They fought not just for their lives, but for something greater. They fought for humanity's survival. They fought for Earth, and they fought for the legacy of those who had given their lives to keep humanity's place in the stars. As the battle raged on, Mark felt the heat of the Deathworlder's weapon pass by his face, but it didn't deter him. He wasn't about to die here. He wasn't about to let his crew die here. They had called for help, and though Earth might not be able to reach them in time, the humans aboard this ship would go down swinging. The Deathworlders were not the only ones with strength and power. Humanity had something they didn't, an unyielding spirit that refused to break. As long as there was breath in their lungs, they would continue to fight. Mark Avery, captain of the USS Orion, wasn't about to let this battle be their last. Reinforcements arrived. The battle had dragged on for hours, each moment feeling like an eternity. Mark Avery, the captain of the USS Orion, stood among the wreckage of his ship, his breath ragged, his body covered in bruises and blood. The sound of enemy weapons firing rang in his ears, but he had lost track of how many times he'd heard it. His crew, the last of the humans aboard, had been pushed to the brink. He couldn't even count how many had fallen, each one a painful reminder of the steep price they were paying for survival. They had fought like lions, holding their ground against an overwhelming enemy, but the Deathworlders were everywhere. Mark glanced over at Sarah, her hands still working tirelessly at the damaged communications console. Despite the carnage, she was still trying to get through to Earth, to make that final connection that could save them. Her face was drawn, her eyes weary, but there was no quitting in her. Not yet. The rest of the crew, what was left of them, were scattered throughout the ship, doing their best to hold back the enemy. Mark could feel the weight of every step, the heaviness in the air that told him the end was near. But still, they fought. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, something shifted. A familiar hum reverberated through the walls. Mark's ears perked up as he turned to Sarah, a flicker of hope breaking through the haze of dread. "Sarah, what is that?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the screen. her fingers flying over the console in a flurry of activity. "Captain, it's them. Earth's fleet is coming." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had prayed for this moment, but he never thought it would come. Earth had received the SOS. Reinforcements were on their way. The faint signal they had sent out had made it across the stars, and the fleet was closer than he ever imagined. But there was no time to celebrate. Mark could feel the tremor in the ship's hull as the Deathworlders responded. They had seen Earth's ships approaching, and they were ready to stop them at any cost. The battle wasn't over. Far from it. "Get ready," Mark said, his voice hard with determination. "They're not going to give up that easily." The crew scrambled into action. The remaining survivors grabbed their weapons and took their positions. They were weak, battered, and exhausted, but they weren't done yet. Not as long as Earth's fleet was coming. Mark felt a surge of strength, knowing that Earth was finally within reach. They might not have much left to fight with, but they still had their spirit. And they would use it until the very end. The first wave of Earth's ships came into view. On the radar, massive, powerful, and ready to fight. Mark could see the insignia on the ships, the symbol of Earth's military strength. It was a sign of hope of survival, and it spurred the remaining crew members into action. The Deathworlders had underestimated humanity, and now they would learn the hard way that Earth wasn't a world they could easily conquer. "They're here!" Sarah shouted, a rare smile breaking through the fear. Mark turned his attention to the battle unfolding outside, the ship's damaged viewport. The Deathworlder ships, massive and menacing, fired upon the Earth fleet without hesitation. The air was filled with the roar of cannons, explosions lighting up the dark void of space. The fight was vicious, and the Deathworlders were relentless. But Earth's fleet was no stranger to war. They fought with everything they had, pushing back against the invaders with precision and power. Mark gripped his rifle tighter, feeling the blood surge in his veins. This was it. This was what they had been waiting for. Earth had answered their call. As the Earth ships opened fire, Mark could see the Deathworlder ships falter. The firepower from Earth's fleet was overwhelming, and slowly but surely, the Deathworlders began to retreat. Their ships were taking damage, and they had no choice but to pull back, unable to withstand the Earth fleet's might. Mark's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. It wasn't over yet, but they had won. The reinforcements had arrived, and the Deathworlders were being driven back. Mark knew that the battle wasn't truly won until every enemy ship was gone, but for now, humanity had survived. Earth had come through. He turned to his crew, his voice hoarse but filled with pride. "We did it. We held on. Earth's here." A cheer erupted among the surviving crew members, a ragged sound, but full of life. They had done it. They had survived, and Earth had come to their aid. The Deathworlders had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now they would feel the full force of it. Mark felt the weight of the moment settle in. His crew had sacrificed so much, and many had fallen, but they had held the line. Earth's fleet was here, and with it, the hope that humanity's future would continue. The battle had been long and brutal, but it was far from over. The Deathworlders had been beaten back, but they would return. That was certain. But for now, Mark allowed himself to believe that Earth had answered the call, and humanity had won. He looked out at the stars, the vast, endless expanse of space. The universe might be dark and dangerous, but Earth had shown that humanity could thrive in it, no matter the cost. The fight wasn't over, but it had just begun. And as long as humans stood together, there was no enemy they couldn't defeat. The final stand, the battle raged outside, the sound of cannons and explosions reverberating through the damaged hull of the USS Orion. Inside, the remaining crew moved with a sense of urgency and determination. They had survived this long, but they knew the true test had yet to come. The Deathworlders had been pushed back by Earth's fleet, but they weren't gone. Mark Avery stood at the bridge, eyes locked on the view screen, watching as Earth's ships engaged the remaining Deathworlder forces. The battle was far from over, but Earth had made its mark. Humanity had made its mark, Captain, Sarah said, her voice breaking through the chaos. The Deathworlders are retreating ... but they're regrouping. They'll be back, and they'll come with everything they've got. They'll try to finish what they started. Mark nodded grimly. The Deathworlders wouldn't stop. They never did. They had shown no mercy before, and they would show none now. But what they didn't realize was that humanity wasn't the same as the enemies they had crushed in the past. Humanity had something that the Deathworlders could never take away. The unbreakable will to fight. "We don't have much time," Mark said, his voice calm but fierce. "Earth's fleet is pushing them back, but we need to make sure we're ready for the next wave. Everyone, get to your stations." As the crew scrambled into action, Mark's thoughts raced. The Deathworlders were formidable, and Earth's fleet, though powerful, was not invincible. The next battle would be the final one. Mark had no illusions about their chances, but he wasn't going to let them go down without making it count. He had seen what his crew was capable of. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were warriors, and they would fight to the very last breath. Sarah worked at her console, her eyes darting across the screens, analyzing data as fast as she could. "Captain, the Deathworlders are realigning their forces. They're preparing for a final assault. It looks like they've called in reinforcements." Mark gritted his teeth, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The odds were impossible, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they still had a ship, and they still had each other. They had Earth's fleet on their side. Now that alone was something the Deathworlders hadn't accounted for. He turned to Sarah. "Are the weapon systems online yet?" Sarah shook her head, frustration written across her face. "Not fully, Captain. The damage is too extensive. But I can activate a few of the weapons manually. It's a long shot, but it might buy us enough time." Mark's mind worked quickly, piecing together their options. The ship was in no condition to fight, but they didn't need it to be perfect. They just needed to hold the line long enough for Earth's fleet to finish the job. Mark felt a fierce determination build inside him. They had come so far. They had fought so hard. This wasn't the end. "Not yet. Do it," he ordered. "Get the weapons online and prepare for the worst." The crew members, though exhausted and injured, were focused. They moved with purpose, their fear replaced with an unwavering sense of duty. Mark watched as Sarah and the others worked in perfect unison, trying to make something out of nothing. There was no backup. There was no miracle coming. They had to rely on each other, and they had to rely on the resolve that had gotten them this far. As Sarah activated the weapon system, Mark's attention shifted back to the view screen. The Deathworlder fleet was still out there, regrouping, preparing for a final assault. Mark knew they wouldn't stop. They had never stopped before, but the crew of the USS Orion wasn't about to let them win. Suddenly, an alarm blared through the ship. Mark's eyes snapped to the console. "They're launching another wave," Sarah said, her voice tight with strain. "They're coming for us again." The sound of the Deathworlders' ships grew louder, a constant rumble in the air. The Earth fleet was still engaged in battle, but the Deathworlders were determined to finish what they had started. Mark could feel the tension building, his muscles tightening as the anticipation of the final confrontation weighed heavily on him. The crew was ready. Mark was ready. And in that moment, as the ship shook with the force of another attack, Mark realized that they had already won. Not because of the outcome, but because they had refused to give up. As the Deathworlders' ships closed in, Mark's voice rang out with the calm authority he had carried throughout this battle. "Everyone, brace yourselves. This is the final stand. We're going to show them what it means to face humanity." The crew stood tall, their faces hardened with determination. They had faced death countless times, and yet somehow they had survived. They had fought against impossible odds, and they had come out stronger for it. This was their moment. They would not let the Deathworlders take this victory. They would hold their ground no matter the cost. The ship shook again as another blast from the Deathworlders hit, but Mark didn't flinch. He stood there, his hand gripping the console, watching as his crew prepared for the final battle. The Deathworlders were coming, but so was Earth, and together, humanity would show them that no enemy, no matter how powerful, could ever break the spirit of those who fought for their survival.